Scripture reading today is going to come from 2 Corinthians. It's a letter to Paul to the Corinth church. It's a very powerful passage of Scriptures. It talks about grace. And we are people filled with grace. This is a grace-filled church. And I want you to pay close attention when Paul is talking about his grace. So we're going to pick up on this letter that Paul is writing in the 12th chapter, the 6th verse. I wish to boast. I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me and heard from me, even considering the exceptional character of the revelations. Therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamity for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Today we begin a new series called Enough. And over the last few years, I've become aware of how many people are struggling with the idea of being enough. I talk to people all the time who are talking about, well, I don't know if I have enough resources to do this or that, or I don't know if I'm good enough to try out for this or that, or I don't know if I'm good enough that I could put myself out there like that. Or even people, when it comes to faith, saying things like, I don't know if I'm faithful enough. I don't know that I've done enough to please God. I had an older gentleman say to me several years ago, as he was near death, I hope I've done enough that the Lord will let me in heaven. And I said to him, you believe in the Lord? You trust in the Lord? He said, I always have. And I said, then I think that's enough. I think that's enough. You know, a lot of us have this idea that we have to earn our way into heaven and earn our way into life. And so a lot of us feel insufficient about our own resources at times. We're not sure that we've done enough or are enough to be all that we need to be. For a lot of situations in life, this is true. And what the Bible talks about is God's grace being sufficient for our needs. The Bible's always lifting up the grace of God. And it's central to our understanding of theology. As United Methodist Christians, grace is central to our understanding of theology. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be talking about how this grace is lived out in our lives, how God's grace is the center for us of what we believe and what we teach about the love of Jesus Christ, and how that grace then works in our lives to strengthen us, to convict us, to move us, to encourage us, and to save us and redeem us. It's God's grace. It's all about God's grace. And it's about God's grace being enough, not about how good we are, but about how good God is. I remember the church lady. Do you remember the church lady from Saturday Night Live days? Church lady was always a little bit more superior than the rest of you. Church lady always was just a little bit better. She was a little more spiritual. She was a little more prayerful than the rest of you. And church lady was always, making others feel worse about themselves rather than better about themselves in terms of their spiritual life. And, all you could say about that was, wasn't that special? Church lady always had that knack for making others feel less than. Now, in the church at Corinth, evidently there were some church ladies. Evidently there were church men or ladies who were making others feel less than, that somehow they didn't measure up. And so in this church there was this spiritual tension that was going on, and Paul was seeking to address this tension throughout his correspondence with the Corinthian church. They're boasting about how spiritual they are, and some are more spiritual than others. And Paul's saying, if anybody could boast, I got to tell you, I have reason to boast if anybody has a reason to boast. And you look at what Paul had done in his life, and Paul he knew the law backwards and forwards. I mean, he tried so hard to live the law, so much so that when those followers of Jesus were in their early days, Paul was one of the ones who was persecuting them and saying they're not on the right track. They're following a false way, and he tried to persecute them and stop them from preaching about this love of Jesus. And one day he was on the road to Damascus to continue to try to stop this movement of Christ that was moving across the country at that time, across the world at that time. And he was blinded. He was struck blind with the light, and had this experience of God's presence with him that caused him to turn. And this guy who was so strong and so self-assured about what he believed and how good he was and how spiritual he was and how righteous he was, suddenly was being led by others, helpless. And he learned something about the grace of God that had been given through Jesus Christ. And he became a follower of Christ. And as he followed Christ, he tried to tell others about this grace that was available to them, and how it was God's grace that was the heart of the whole thing. That it's not about how we earn our way into heaven by our righteousness or by how good we are. It's about what God has already done for us in Jesus Christ, and believing and trusting in that we then live and move and have our being. And so as he's explaining this to the Corinthian church, he brings up his own situation. He says, I could boast, but I'm not going to. In fact, to keep me from boasting, I've had this issue in my life that kind of keeps me humble. And we don't know exactly what this is, but he called it a thorn in the flesh. Now, scholars have debated for centuries about what that thorn in the flesh was that plagued Paul. Some people believe it was a deformity of some kind or outward appearance that made him unsightly to others. Some believe it was epilepsy. Some believe it was this internal spiritual struggle that he was going through, some kind of temptation that he continued to struggle with. Some believe that it was opposition to him, that people that were opposed to him were a thorn in the flesh to him. Some have even suggested it was a woman. I don't know. I don't know. I just, somehow he had a thorn in the flesh that kept him from being overly proud of himself. He was humbled by it. And he kept praying about it. And the answer that he got was, my grace is sufficient. That was God's answer. My grace is sufficient. What would it mean for you to come to a place in your life where, as you look at your relationship with God, that you trusted in God's grace enough to be able to say, God's grace is sufficient for whatever I face? I know that some of you have said what I've said in my life at times when I've faced things. I don't know how we're going to get through this. I don't know how we're going to deal with this. I don't know how we're going to face this. I don't know how to go on from this. And I've heard some of you say those words, and I've said those words before. I don't know how we're going to deal with this. And what I've discovered, and what so many of you have discovered, is that God's grace was sufficient for what you needed to get you through those days when you didn't know how you were going to go on. God's grace was enough. When you didn't feel like you were enough, or you had enough in terms of your own resources, God's grace was enough. Sufficient. A friend of mine several years ago worked at a Ferrari dealership. True story. Picks me up for lunch in a Testarossa Ferrari. I had never been in a Testarossa Ferrari before. It cost more than my house. And I get in this. Any astronauts in the room, or fighter pilots that have been on a F-15 or something? When he took off down Central Expressway heading north, I don't know how fast we were going, but I felt like the G-forces, were pulling me back, and I felt like I was sitting on top of a powerful jet engine. I couldn't believe the power of that thing. We got where we were going at lunch, and I said, "Man, what's the horsepower of that engine?" And he just looked at me like I was the silliest person in the whole world. He just said, "It's sufficient." Sufficient. Sufficient for what you need. That's what God's grace is. God's grace is enough. A lot of us, for us, we think it's about our own strength and power. And so a lot of us think, if I just have enough faith, then I can get through anything. Or if I just have enough, if I just will be righteous enough, or study enough, or pray enough, or be spiritual enough, then I'll have the strength. But then we come up against something that's so powerfully strong, we feel weak in comparison. I know the most positive thinkers in the world who have been humbled by the realities of life. And positive thinking's not enough. And just feeling like you have nothing, no resources, you feel so weak. And Paul says it so beautifully in this passage. When I am weak, and understanding, that God is a God of grace, it's when I understand my own weakness, that's when I'm strong. Because I know it's not about my own strength. It's about God's strength. You remember that song that you learned when you were a child? Some of you learned this song. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Little ones to him belong. They are, but he is. Yes. It's not about how strong you are. It's about the strength and the sufficiency of God's grace to carry you. So what do you do in response to a grace like that? And that's what the Christian life is, in my understanding. It is a response to God's grace. It is a response to a God who loves us so much that he gave us his Son, given for us in love. So we respond. That's our part. And John Wesley talked about the means of grace, the ways that we can put ourselves in touch with this grace. Some of those are individual practices of faith, prayer and Bible study. Some of those are corporate acts of worship and praise and singing hymns and participating in life together, acts of mercy, acts of service. One of those things that he talked about was the corporate act of receiving Holy Communion, the sacraments of the church, as a way that we get in touch with God's grace. We understand that it's not about our strength, but it's God's strength at work in us that is enough. So I invite you to come to this table today and receive, but also to be challenged about how you will respond to this grace. The things we do outwardly to be people of faith, to live our faith, are really signs of our response. It's what we do in response to a God who loves us so much. We don't do those things to try to earn God's grace. We do those things in response to God's grace. And I think that little difference makes all the difference in terms of how we live our lives. So I invite you to come and receive these outward symbols of grace, that you may know in your own heart, God's grace is enough. God's grace is sufficient for everything you face.